They said the ground was too cold to hold any kind of life, let alone hope. But Ethan Walker kept digging anyway, as if he knew something the rest of the town had forgotten. The first night it started, the wind moved through the narrow street like a quiet warning, brushing against old wooden porches and rattling loose shutters with a hollow, restless sound. And under a single dim porch light behind a weather-worn house, a man and his German shepherd worked in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed while the frozen earth resisted every strike of the shovel. Hard as iron and stubborn as memory, yet Ethan did not rush and did not curse. He simply drove the blade down again and again with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that survival was rarely loud and never easy. Across the street, a couple of neighbors had gathered, arms folded against the cold, their laughter low but sharp enough to carry, wondering out loud why a grown man would choose to dig a hole in the ground when his roof still leaked and his windows rattled with every gust of wind. And someone muttered that the war must have taken more from him than anyone realized, that maybe the quiet ones were the ones who broke the hardest. But Ethan never looked up and never answered because he had heard worse in places far colder than this, and from voices far less kind. Beside him, Ranger moved with a different kind of awareness, the 6-year-old German shepherd pausing every few moments to press his paw into the soil, nose low, ears shifting towards something no one else could hear, and once he stopped completely, body still as stone, then gave a soft, deliberate scratch at a single patch of earth as if marking a place that mattered, and Ethan noticed, of course he did, because Ranger had never been wrong about things that couldn't be explained, not in all the years they had stayed alive together. And so Ethan adjusted his position, drove the shovel deeper where the dog had pointed, and for a brief second, just beneath the frozen crust, there was something different, a subtle give in the ground, a faint whisper of warmth that didn't belong to the season. The laughter behind him grew louder when the hole widened, when the shape of it no longer looked like a mistake but something intentional, something hidden, and one of the neighbors shook his head and said it looked like a bunker for a man preparing for the end of the world. But Ethan kept working, his gloves worn thin, his shoulders steady, his eyes focused not on what others saw, but on what he felt beneath his hands, because he understood something they didn't, something the cold had taught him over years of silence. That sometimes the safest place wasn't above ground where everything could be taken by wind and chance, but below it, where the earth still remembered how to hold warmth long after the surface had forgotten. Ranger let out a low breath and lay down beside the growing hollow, watching the darkness deepen as if guarding an entrance not yet finished, and the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a softer tone, almost like the land itself had decided to listen, and though no one on that street would have believed it, something quiet and patient had already begun to change beneath their feet, something that would outlast the laughter and outlive the cold, waiting for the moment when winter would come, hard enough to make everyone understand. By the time the second night settled over the town, the temperature had dropped below 15 degrees, and the kind of cold that crept in was not the loud, biting kind that made people complain, but the quiet kind that slipped through walls, settled into floorboards, and stayed there, patient and unmoving, and Ethan Walker could feel it even before he stepped outside. The way the air pressed against his lungs and slowed each breath just enough to remind him that winter was not something you waited for. It was something that arrived whether you were ready or not. Inside the house, the single-space heater hummed weakly, struggling against drafts that whispered through the cracks of old wood, and the windows trembled softly as if they were tired of holding back the night. And Ethan stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the frame, listening not to the wind, but to the silence behind it, the kind of silence he had learned to trust more than noise, because silence always meant something was changing. Ranger rose from his place near the door without being called, stretching slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, then moved toward Ethan with a quiet certainty, amber eyes fixed, ears angled forward as if he had already heard the next step before it happened. And when Ethan opened the door, the cold air did not rush in. It settled, like it had been waiting just outside, and together they stepped into it without hesitation. The dugout had grown deeper, wider now, its shape no longer uncertain, the walls packed firm with frozen soil that held together better than any wood Ethan could have afforded, and the entrance sloped down at a careful angle, just enough to break the wind, just enough to keep the warmth from escaping. And as Ethan climbed down into it, he noticed again what had first made him pause the night before, that subtle difference in the air. Not warm exactly, but not empty either, as if the ground itself carried a memory of heat that had not yet faded. Ranger moved ahead of him, paused silent against the packed earth, then stopped at the far end, nose low, breathing in slow, deliberate pulls, and once again he pressed his paw into the same spot, scratching lightly, not with urgency, but with insistence, and Ethan knelt beside him, placing his gloved hand against the wall where the dog indicated, and there it was again, faint but real, a trace of something that did not belong to frozen ground, something that suggested structure beneath structure, intention beneath chance. He reached for the small hand shovel and began to clear the area more carefully, not digging now, but uncovering, brushing away layers of soil with the patience of someone who understood that rushing could mean missing what mattered, and after a few minutes, the metal edge struck something that did not sound like stone, a dull, hollow note that echoed softly in the confined space, and Ethan paused, listening, feeling the vibration travel back through the handle into his palm, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not out of doubt, but recognition, because he had felt that kind of resistance before, years ago, when searching beneath collapsed structures for spaces that might still hold air, still hold life. Ranger let out a low breath and sat back, watching, his body calm now, as if the uncertainty had shifted into something steadier, and Ethan brushed away the remaining dirt until the outline of old wood began to show, weathered and dark, reinforced at one edge with a rusted metal hinge that had not moved in decades, and the sight of it did not surprise him as much as it should have, because somewhere between the first strike of the shovel and this moment, he had already understood that he was not the first person to choose this place, that someone else, long before the laughter, had stood here and made the same decision too. Trust the ground over the sky. Above them, the wind picked up again, stronger now, rattling through the trees and sweeping across the open yards, and somewhere in the distance a door slammed shut, sharp and sudden, but down inside the dugout, the sound arrived softened, distant, as if filtered through layers of earth that refused to let the outside world fully in, and Ethan rested his hand on the buried hatch for a long second, feeling the quiet steadiness beneath it, while Ranger lay down beside him, head lowered, eyes half closed but alert, guarding not just the space, but the truth that was slowly revealing itself, that what had been hidden here was never meant to be found by chance, only by someone willing to keep digging long after everyone else had stopped believing there was anything worth finding. The hinge did not move at first, not because it was locked, but because it had forgotten what it meant to be opened, and Ethan Walker understood that kind of resistance better than most. So he did not force it. He cleared the edges instead, brushing away the last of the frozen soil with careful hands until the outline of the buried hatch revealed itself fully, a narrow rectangle set into the earth at an angle, built with intention and patience by someone who had once needed this place as much as he did now. And when he finally placed both hands on the wood and pulled, the sound that followed was not loud. It was slow and dry, like something waking up after a long and quiet sleep. Cold air did not rush out from below. Instead, a stillness rose up to meet him, a deeper kind of silence that felt protected rather than empty. And Ranger shifted forward immediately, lowering his head and stepping closer to the opening, his ears high, his body alert but not tense, as if whatever lay beneath was not a threat, but something older, something worth noticing. And Ethan waited a moment before leaning down, letting his eyes adjust to the dim shape below where a narrow ladder, half buried in shadow, descended into a space that the earth had kept hidden for longer than anyone above ground remembered. The wind howled faintly behind him, brushing across the entrance of the dugout. But down here the sound softened, losing its edge, becoming something distant and almost irrelevant, and Ethan felt that shift immediately, the difference between being exposed and being held, the kind of difference that could decide whether a man made it through winter or not, and he exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding since the first strike of his shovel days before. He reached for the flashlight tucked into his jacket pocket and switched it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness below, revealing packed earth walls reinforced with old timber, a small space just wide enough for a man to sit, maybe lie down, and along one side. A simple vent pipe angled upward, carefully placed to draw air without letting the cold settle too deep, and Ethan recognized the design instantly, not from a book, but from memory, from training that had once been. About survival in places where comfort was not an option and warmth was something you built with your own hands, or did not have at all. Ranger descended first, his paws steady on the worn rungs, his body moving with quiet confidence, as if he trusted the space before Ethan had even made the decision to follow. And when the dog reached the bottom, he turned once, looking up with those steady amber eyes that had never lied, and Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, then stepped down into the hidden room beneath the ground. The temperature changed the moment his boots touched the packed floor, not dramatically, but enough that the air no longer bit at his face, enough that his fingers, stiff from hours in the cold, began to ease just slightly inside his gloves, and he stood there for a long moment, turning slowly, taking in the small details that spoke louder than anything else. The way the corners had been reinforced, the way the vent had been angled with care, the faint outline of an old shelf carved into the wall where supplies might once have rested, and for a second, it felt less like he had discovered something new and more like he had stepped into a space that had been waiting, patient and quiet, for someone who would understand why it had been built. Above them, another gust of wind swept across the yard, rattling something loose against the side of the house, and Ethan glanced upward instinctively, but the sound arrived softened, almost distant, as if the earth itself had chosen to stand between him and the worst of it, and he let out a slow breath. One that carried a different weight now, not relief exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer entirely at the mercy of what is coming. Ranger circled once, then settled near the base of the ladder, head lifted, listening not to the wind, but to the quiet stability of the ground around them, and Ethan rested his hand against the timber wall, feeling the solidness of it, the intention behind it. And for the first time since the neighbors had laughed, since the first shovel struck frozen earth, he allowed himself to believe that what they had built, or perhaps rebuilt, was not just a hole in the ground, but something far more important, something that would hold when everything above it began to fail, something that had already proven, in its silence and its strength, that it knew how to outlast the cold. By the time morning came, the sky had turned a pale, brittle gray, the kind that carried no warmth even when the sun tried to rise, and a thin layer of frost clung to everything above ground, tracing every branch, every rooftop, every uneven edge of the town as if winter had quietly claimed it overnight. But beneath the surface, inside the small chamber Ethan Walker now stood in, the air held steady, not warm enough to be comfortable, but stable enough to be trusted, and that difference, subtle as it was, meant more than anything he had felt in weeks. He climbed back up the ladder slowly, emerging into the dugout as Ranger followed close behind, and for a moment he paused at the opening, looking out across the yard where the wind had left faint patterns in the dusting of snow, and everything appeared still, almost peaceful, as if the world above had no idea what had been uncovered just a few feet below it. The house behind him creaked softly, the old wood shifting with the temperature drop, and Ethan turned toward it, studying the sagging roofline, the windows that no longer sealed properly, the thin walls that would not stand a chance against the deeper cold still on its way. And for the first time, he did not feel the quiet pressure of trying to fix something that could not be saved, because now he understood that survival was not about restoring what had already failed, but about recognizing what still had strength left in it. Ranger moved ahead again, circling the dugout entrance before settling near the edge, his gaze fixed not on the house, but on the ground, as if he had already chosen where safety would come from, and Ethan nodded faintly, then set to work, not digging anymore, but shaping, reinforcing, turning the dugout into something deliberate rather than desperate. He used what little lumber he had left to brace the entrance, angling the boards to break the wind, packing the surrounding soil tighter to seal gaps, and every movement carried a quiet precision, the kind that came from years of building things that needed to hold under pressure, things that could not afford to fail once they were tested. As the hours passed, the sound of tools carried lightly across the yard, and once again, the neighbors noticed, drawn by the same curiosity that had turned into laughter the night before, and one by one they appeared along the edge of the road, bundled in thick coats. Watching as Ethan worked without pause, their expressions shifting now, not entirely mocking, but not yet understanding either. Because what they saw was still just a man choosing the ground over the house, still just a decision. That did not fit the way most people thought things should be done. One of them called out, asking if he planned to live down there all winter, and Ethan glanced up briefly, not annoyed, not defensive, just calm, and answered in a voice that carried no argument, only certainty, saying that the ground holds heat better than air if you let it. And the man laughed softly, shaking his head as if that answer confirmed what he already believed, that Ethan was chasing something that did not exist. But Ethan did not try to explain further, because he knew that understanding rarely came from words alone. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted again, colder now, sharper, and the sky darkened earlier than it should have, pressing the town into a quiet that felt heavier than usual, and Ethan finished reinforcing the entrance just as the first real gusts of the coming front began to move through, carrying with them the promise of a storm that would test more than just patience. He climbed down once more into the chamber below, this time bringing with him a small lantern, a wool blanket, and a thermos that held what little warmth he could still create above ground, and Ranger followed without hesitation, settling near the ladder as if taking his post, and when Ethan lit the lantern, the soft glow filled the space, revealing again the careful design, the way the walls curved slightly to hold heat, the way the air moved just enough to stay fresh without letting the cold settle in, and he sat there, back against the timber, listening as the wind outside began to rise. It did not take long for the storm to arrive, the first real wave of winter pushing against the town with a steady, relentless force, and above them, the house groaned under the pressure, boards shifting, nails creaking, but down below, the sound softened into something distant, almost manageable, and Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in quiet acknowledgement, because what had once looked like a last resort had already begun to prove itself as something else entirely. Something steady, something patient, something that did not need to be believed in by others to do exactly what it had been built to do. And as Ranger rested his head on his paws, eyes half open, listening to the world above, Ethan understood that sometimes the strongest shelter was the one no one else thought to look for until it was too late. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built itself slowly through the evening, layering wind over wind until the air above the town no longer moved in gusts but in a constant, pressing force that wrapped around houses and pressed against windows with a quiet persistence. And as night deepened, the temperature dropped even further, slipping below 10 degrees, the kind of cold that did not just settle outside but reached inward, testing every weak seam, every thin wall, every place where warmth tried to hold on and failed. Above ground, lights flickered along the street, then steadied, then flickered again, and somewhere down the block a generator coughed to life before falling silent, and one by one, the small signs of comfort that people depended on began to falter, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, enough to plant the first quiet seed of concern in minds that had been certain they were prepared. Inside the dugout, Ethan Walker sat with his back against the timber wall, the lantern casting a soft, steady glow that barely shifted despite the rising wind outside, and the difference between above and below became clearer with every passing minute, because down here the air remained calm, held in place by the weight of the earth itself, and the cold, though present, no longer bit with the same sharp edge, it lingered instead at a distance, as if the ground had decided to soften it before allowing it in. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears forward, body alert in a way that was different from before, not focused on the ground this time, but on something beyond the dugout, something carried through the wind from the direction of the street, and Ethan noticed immediately, because the dog had a way of marking moments that mattered, and without a word, Ethan reached for his coat and climbed the ladder, pushing the hatch open into a night that had grown louder, the wind now threading through the trees with a low, continuous sound that seemed to hum beneath everything else. Snow had begun to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in thin, fast lines that moved sideways through the air, driven by the wind into every corner, every gap, every place where it could gather, and as Ethan stepped out, he saw movement across the yard, a figure struggling against the gusts, leaning into the cold as if it were something solid, and behind that figure, a smaller shape, uncertain, slowing with each step. Ranger moved past Ethan without hesitation, bounding across the yard with controlled urgency, stopping a few feet from the figures and standing firm. A steady point in a world that had begun to shift, and Ethan followed quickly, boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that was already building. And as he reached them, he recognized the woman from across the street, Mrs. Carter, her face pale from the cold, her coat pulled tight but not enough to keep the wind out, and beside her, her grandson, no older than 10, his small hands tucked into sleeves that were too thin for a night like this. Her voice carried through the wind, strained but steady, explaining that the heat had gone out, that the power would not hold, that the house was growing colder by the minute. And for a brief second, Ethan saw the hesitation in her eyes, the memory of laughter not yet gone, the uncertainty of asking help from the man she had not understood, but he did not let that moment linger. He simply nodded once and turned back toward the dugout, motioning for them to follow. Ranger fell in beside the boy, walking close, guiding without touching, his presence quiet but reassuring, and together they moved back through the yard, the wind pressing at their backs, the snow beginning to gather along the ground in uneven lines. And when Ethan reached the entrance, he held it open, letting them step down first, one careful step at a time, into the space below. The change was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. The wind cut away, the noise softened, the cold eased just enough for breath to come easier, and Mrs. Carter paused at the bottom, looking around the small chamber with a kind of quiet disbelief, as if she had stepped into something she had not expected to exist, and the boy exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping for the first time since they had crossed the yard. Ethan followed last, pulling the hatch closed above them, sealing out the storm with a simple motion that felt heavier than it should have, and as the lantern lights steadied again, casting warm shadows against the packed earth walls, the space seemed to settle, holding them all in a calm that did not need to be explained, and Ranger lay down near the entrance once more, head lifted, listening, not to the laughter that had once filled the street, but to the quiet shift that had replaced it. The moment when something once dismissed had begun to prove its worth in the only way that truly mattered. The hours passed slowly, measured not by clocks but by the steady rhythm of the storm above, a constant low roar that rose and fell like something alive, pressing against the town with a quiet determination. And inside the dugout, time seemed to move differently, softer, less urgent, as if the earth itself had taken hold of it and decided to stretch each moment just enough to let people breathe again. Mrs. Carter sat with her back against the packed wall, her hands wrapped around the thermos Ethan had passed to her, the warmth seeping slowly into her fingers, and though her coat was still damp from the snow, the tremble in her shoulders had begun to ease, replaced by a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with relief, while her grandson sat close beside Ranger, his small hand resting gently on the dog's thick fur, as if anchoring himself to something steady in a night that had taken everything else out of balance. Ethan moved quietly within the small space, adjusting the lantern, checking the edges of the chamber, listening more than looking, because what mattered now was not what could be seen, but what could be felt, the subtle shifts in air, the way the temperature held, the way the walls responded to the pressure above, and each time he paused, each time he placed his hand against the timber or the packed earth, he felt the same thing, a quiet resilience, a sense that this place had already endured storms before and knew how to endure this one as well. Ranger lifted his head again after a while, not with urgency, but with attention, his ears turning slightly toward the ladder, and Ethan followed the movement, listening past the wind, past the low hum of the storm, until he heard it too, faint at first, then clearer, the sound of footsteps above, uneven, hesitant, accompanied by a voice calling out into the night, carried thinly through the layers of snow and air. Ethan stood without a word, moving toward the ladder, and when he opened the hatch, the wind pushed against it immediately, stronger now, colder, the snow swirling in tighter patterns that blurred the edges of everything. And just beyond the entrance, another figure appeared, bent slightly against the gusts, one arm shielding his face, the other reaching forward as if searching for something that could not be seen. It was Mr. Hale from 2 houses down, a man who had laughed the loudest the night before, his voice always quick to carry across the street. But now there was no laughter, only a quiet urgency, a question he did not need to fully speak because the answer was already in front of him. Ethan stepped aside, holding the hatch open, and Mr. Hale did not hesitate, climbing down carefully, his boots slipping once on the frozen rung before finding steadiness again. And as he reached the bottom, he stopped, looking around the small chamber with a kind of disbelief that mirrored what Mrs. Carter had felt earlier, as if he had stepped into something that should not have worked but clearly did. No one said much at first, because there was not much that needed to be said. The truth of the space spoke for itself, in the way the air held, in the way the wind no longer reached them, in the way the cold, though present, no longer dominated every breath. And Mr. Hale lowered himself against the opposite wall, his shoulders relaxing slowly as the tension of the storm began to slip away, replaced by a quiet understanding that settled deeper than words could reach. Above them, the storm continued, stronger now, pressing harder against the town, testing roofs, rattling windows, moving through empty spaces where heat had once been. And for the first time that night, Ethan allowed himself to remain still, not because there was nothing left to do, but because what needed to hold was already holding. And as he looked around the small chamber, at the faces that had once watched him with doubt and now sat in quiet acceptance, he understood that the dugout was no longer just a place he had built for himself. It had become something else entirely, something shared, something that carried a purpose beyond survival alone. And Ranger, lying near the ladder with his eyes half closed but listening, seemed to know it too, his presence calm and steady, as if he had been waiting not just for the storm, but for this moment when the ground beneath them proved, without a single word, that it could hold more than just warmth. It could hold people together when everything above them began to fall apart. The storm reached its peak sometime after midnight, not with a sudden surge but with a steady, unrelenting pressure that seemed to settle over the entire town like a weight that would not lift. And above the ground, the wind no longer howled in bursts but moved in a continuous force that bent trees, rattled every loose board, and erased the edges of streets and yards beneath layers of drifting snow. But inside the dugout, the world had narrowed to a small, steady circle of light and breath, where the air held firm and the cold no longer dictated every movement. The lantern flickered once, then steadied again, casting soft shadows that moved gently along the curved walls. And in that quiet, the people gathered there began to shift, not physically at first, but in the way they carried themselves, the way their shoulders lowered, the way their voices, when they finally spoke, softened into something more thoughtful, less certain, as if the storm above had stripped away the distance that had once existed between them. Mrs. Carter spoke first, her voice low, almost hesitant, thanking Ethan not in the quick, passing way people often did, but in a tone that held weight, as if she understood that what had been offered was more than just shelter. And Mr. Hale followed, his words fewer, slower, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect than he might have expected to feel. And Ethan listened without interrupting, nodding once, not dismissing their words, but not holding on to them either, because for him, the reason for opening the hatch had never been about being proven right. Ranger shifted slightly near the ladder, his ears tilting as the wind above surged again, and for a moment, the sound filtered down more strongly, a deep, rolling pressure that seemed to press against the earth itself. And the boy looked up, eyes wide, his small hand tightening briefly in the dog's fur, and Ranger responded the only way he knew how, by remaining still, by breathing slowly, by offering a presence that did not change even when everything else did. Ethan reached over and adjusted the lantern wick, keeping the flame steady, and then he spoke, not loudly, not as someone giving instruction, but simply as someone sharing what he had learned, explaining that the ground held heat because it remembered it, that even in winter, a few feet below the surface, the temperature changed slower, steadier, and that the shape of the chamber, the way the entrance angled, the way the vent allowed air to move without carrying the cold too deep, all of it worked together in ways that most people never needed to think about until a night like this forced them to. Mr. Hale listened closely, his brow furrowed not in doubt now, but in realization, and he glanced around the space again, seeing it differently, not as a whole or a strange decision, but as something built with purpose, something that had been understood long before it had been questioned. Above them, a sudden crack echoed faintly, the sound of something shifting under the weight of snow and wind, and though it did not reach them directly, it carried enough through the earth to remind them how exposed the world above had become, and for a brief second, no one spoke, the silence settling deeper than before, not uncomfortable, but aware. Ethan rested his hand against the wall again, feeling the steady resistance of packed earth and timber, and in that touch, there was a quiet confirmation, not just that the structure would hold, but that it had been meant to hold, that it had been designed by someone who had understood the same kind of nights, the same kind of pressure, and had chosen to leave behind something that would outlast him. Ranger lowered his head again, eyes half closed but still listening, and the boy leaned gently against his side, no longer tense, no longer watching the hatch with worry, but trusting the space they were in, and as the storm continued above, relentless and unseen, the dugout remained unchanged, a small, steady place beneath it all, where the laughter that once filled the street had been replaced by something quieter, something stronger, a shared understanding that sometimes the things that seem the least certain are the ones that hold the firmest when it matters most. Somewhere near dawn, the storm began to lose its edge, not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways, the wind no longer pressing as hard against the earth, the constant roar softening into something that rose and fell instead of holding steady. And inside the dugout, the shift was felt before it was heard, a subtle easing in the air, a quiet release of tension that had been held through the long hours of night. Ethan Walker opened his eyes slowly, not fully asleep before, but resting in that careful stillness he had learned over years of listening more than moving. And for a moment, he simply sat there, taking in the way the space around him remained unchanged, the lantern still glowing low, the air still steady, the walls still holding, and it was in that consistency that he understood something deeper than relief, something closer to respect for the hands that had first shaped this place long before he ever arrived. Ranger lifted his head at the same moment, ears turning slightly, not toward danger, but toward absence, the absence of the relentless force that had filled the night, and he stood, stretching slowly before moving toward the far corner where Ethan had uncovered the old wood and hinge, and he paused there again, nose brushing along the edge of the buried structure as if reminding Ethan that there was still more to be seen, more to be understood beneath what had already been revealed. Ethan rose and moved beside him, crouching low, and in the quiet that followed, he noticed something he had missed before, a narrow seam along the inner wall, just below the level of the hatch, a line too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be ignored, and with careful hands, he brushed away the packed dirt that had settled into it over time, uncovering a small recess built into the wall itself, hidden just enough that it would not be found unless someone was looking for it with patience. Inside the recess, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had long since faded to a dull gray, was a small metal tin, its surface worn but intact, and Ethan hesitated for a moment before opening it, not out of fear, but out of a quiet understanding that whatever lay inside was not meant for curiosity alone, but for recognition. When the lid finally gave way, it revealed a few simple items, a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, a small compass, its glass scratched but still clear, and a pencil worn down to nearly nothing, and Ethan picked up the paper first, unfolding it slowly, careful not to let it tear under his hands. The writing was steady, deliberate, each letter pressed into the page with intention, and though the ink had faded, the words remained clear enough to read, a short set of notes, not instructions exactly, but observations, reminders written by someone who had understood this place in the same way Ethan was beginning to, notes about the way the ground held heat, even when the air failed, about the importance of sealing the entrance against wind, about the vent that must remain open no matter how cold it felt, and at the bottom, a single line that stood apart from the rest, written slightly darker, as if it had been added later, reading that this place was built not just to survive the winter, but to outlast it, and to be found by someone who would know why it mattered. Ethan read the line twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the tin, his hand resting there for a moment longer than necessary. And when he looked up, he found that the others had been watching quietly, not intruding, but aware that something had shifted again, something that went beyond warmth or shelter, something that carried a sense of continuity that none of them had expected to find. Mr. Hale leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer skeptical, but thoughtful, as if he too understood that what they were sitting in was more than a structure. It was a message left behind in a form that did not need explanation, and Mrs. Carter exhaled softly, her gaze moving along the walls with a kind of quiet appreciation, as if she could now see the care that had gone into every part of it. Ranger returned to Ethan's side and sat, his presence steady as always, and outside. The first faint light of morning began to press through the storm, filtering down through the entrance in a pale, diffused glow, and though the town above had not yet revealed what the night had taken or left behind, the space below remained unchanged, holding its quiet strength, its quiet purpose, and in that stillness, Ethan understood that what he had uncovered was not just a way to stay warm, but a piece of something larger, something that had been waiting through years of silence for the moment it would be needed again, and that sometimes the most valuable things were not hidden because they were meant to be kept, but because they were meant to be found by the right hands at the right time. When Ethan Walker finally pushed the hatch open again, the morning had already settled into a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar, the kind of silence that followed something heavy passing through, leaving behind a stillness that did not rush to explain itself. And as he stepped out onto the snow-covered ground, the world looked both unchanged and entirely different at the same time. The houses still standing, the trees still upright, but everything softened under a thick, unbroken layer of white that erased the sharp edges of the night before. The air was cold, still below freezing, but it no longer carried that relentless pressure, and for the first time in hours, Ethan could hear something other than wind, the faint creak of settling wood, the distant crunch of boots as someone else stepped outside, the quiet signs that the town was beginning to wake and take account of what it had endured. Ranger climbed up beside him, pausing at the edge of the dugout, his nose lifting slightly as he tested the air, ears relaxed now, no longer searching for warning, but simply observing, and Ethan rested his hand briefly against the dog's shoulder before looking back toward the house, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of snow, its windows rimmed with frost, but still standing, still holding together just enough. And he understood then that what had been spared above ground had not been by strength alone, but by the fact that the worst of the night had been met somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere that had carried the burden without being seen. One by one, the others emerged from the dugout, Mrs. Carter stepping carefully onto the packed snow, her face pale but steady, her grandson close behind, his movements lighter now, no longer weighed down by the cold, and Mr. Hale followed last, pausing at the top to look back down into the space before turning toward Ethan with a look that held more than gratitude, something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. No one hurried away, not immediately, because the moment held them there, the shared memory of the night settling quietly between them, and for a while they simply stood in the pale morning light, each of them seeing the same yard, the same dugout, the same man and dog, but understanding it differently than they had before. Across the street, doors began to open, people stepping out slowly, surveying the damage, calling to one another in voices that carried both relief and concern. And as they noticed the small group gathered near Ethan's yard, their attention shifted, curiosity replacing routine, and a few of them approached, asking questions that were less certain now, less dismissive, as if the storm had changed not just the temperature, but the way things were seen. Ethan did not explain everything. He did not point to the hatch or describe what lay beneath it in detail. He simply said that the ground held steady when the air did not, that sometimes the safest place was not the one that looked the strongest, and the words settled among them without argument, because after a night like that, proof did not need to be loud. As the morning continued, people began to move again, clearing paths, checking on neighbors, rebuilding small routines piece by piece. But something had shifted beneath it all, something that could not be brushed away with the snow. And by the time the sun climbed a little higher, casting a pale light across the town, the dugout was no longer something hidden or misunderstood. It had become a place people glanced toward with quiet recognition, a place that had held when everything else had been tested. Over the following days, as the cold remained and the snow lingered, the dugout saw more use than Ethan had ever intended, not as a refuge of last resort, but as a place people came to understand, to learn from, to sit in for a while, and feel the difference between what stood above and what held below. And Ethan did not turn anyone away, not because he sought company, but because he understood what it meant to find something that worked when nothing else did. Ranger remained where he always had been, near the entrance, watching, listening, his presence as steady as the ground itself, and the boy from across the street returned often, sitting beside him in quiet companionship, as if drawn not just to the dog, but to the calm that seemed to gather there. Weeks passed, the winter settling in fully, but the fear that had once accompanied it did not return in the same way, because now there was a place that had already proven itself, a place built not for comfort, but for endurance, and that made all the difference. And on certain evenings, when the light faded early and the cold pressed in again, Ethan would stand at the edge of the dugout, looking out across the quiet street, the houses glowing softly from within, the snow reflecting what little light remained, and he would rest his hand against the packed earth beside him, feeling its quiet strength. And though he had never set out to prove anything to anyone, he understood now that some things did not need to be defended or explained, they simply needed to hold when it mattered most. And in that holding, they spoke for themselves in a way no laughter ever could.